There's just no comparison, no recourse for human beings once the gods decide to mess up their lives. I wanted to talk about two stories that are right next to each other in Ovid's epic, The Metamorphoses. So Ovid is one of our most famous Latin authors, and he lived under the reign of Augustus, is exiled, and dies at the beginning of the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. And his epic, The Metamorphoses, is about forms changing into new bodies. And that sounds very vague, but there's really no more specific way of talking about it. But if you're familiar with Roman myths and with stories of people changing into other shapes, most likely you're familiar with the version from Ovid. Today I want to talk about one of the most famous stories and one that's slightly less well known that follows it right away. But I think they're both very useful for thinking about the problem of concentrated power in an individual. What we might think of today as executive power, but which the Romans placed in the, or which Ovid placed in the figure of the gods here. So the first is the story of Arachne. Arachne is a girl who lives out in a small town, and she's not particularly wealthy or highborn, but she's very, very good at one thing, which is weaving. She has this preternatural ability to weave things that are more beautiful than anything else. And she's so good at it that it's even a pleasure to watch her. But whenever people ask Arachne where she got her skill, if she got it from some goddess, she gets very offended. And she insists that she did not learn her skill from Minerva. Minerva is also known as Athena in a Greek context, and she's a goddess of weaving, among other things. And so whenever people say, oh, Arachne, you must have learned this from Minerva, she gets very upset and offended. And she says, Minerva had nothing to do with this. This is my skill. So Minerva hears about this, and she comes down in disguise to Arachne, dressed as an old woman. And she says, Arachne, don't you think that you got some of this from Minerva? Arachne gets very angry, and she says, if you really think that Minerva is so good at weaving, she should come down here and we should have a competition. So Minerva throws off her costume and they have the competition. They both set about their weaving. And Arachne's tapestry that she makes, which is supposed to be surpassingly beautiful, depicts stories of humans being mistreated by gods. Over and over again, she shows us stories of innocent human beings whose lives are ruined by gods. At the end of the competition, it's clear that Arachne's tapestry is better. And Minerva takes it, tears it up, hits Arachne over the head with the shuttle that they've been using to weave. So Arachne hangs herself out of shame. And Minerva picks her up from where she's hanging, and she says, you can just keep on spinning forever. And instead of letting Arachne die, she turns her into a spider, which is where we get our name for spiders, arachnids. So that's the story of Arachne, and it's immediately followed in Ovid by the story of Niobe, which follows a similar pattern. Niobe is a wealthy queen, and she has 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters. And Niobe, Ovid tells us, is extremely happy and would have been one of the happiest women of all if she had not known she were. Niobe gets very angry when she sees people worshiping Latona, the goddess mother of Apollo and Diana. And she points out that Latona is really not that worthy of worship because she only has 2 children, whereas Niobe has 14. She says, if you worship anybody, you should be worshiping me. Latona hears this and gets extremely angry, and so she tells her powerful children, Apollo and Diana, to avenge her. So Apollo goes and he shoots every single one of Niobe's sons, all 7 boys. And one by one, we see them fall. And Niobe stands among their bodies. She's obviously devastated, but she's still defiant. She says, look, you've killed 7 of my children, and I still have more than Latona. I still have 7 girls. And as she's saying this, Diana shoots all 7 of her daughters too, even the last, who's so small that Niobe tries to hold her in her skirts to hide her. At this, Niobe is so devastated that she cries until she turns to stone. And that's the end of her story. I think when we're looking at these stories, we should think about them as a picture of unconstrained power. We have reason to believe that Ovid meant us to think this, though, of course, Ovid is so clever, you can never really be sure what he's actually thinking. But if we look at the way Ovid depicts the gods, there are a couple of features of this story that I want to bring out for thinking about untrammeled power. The first is the enormous difference in power between Arachne and Niobe on the one hand and the gods on the other. There's just no comparison, no recourse for human beings once the gods decide to mess up their lives. Now, To the ancients, this is not an unexpected or unfamiliar way of thinking about the gods. Ancient Greek and Roman gods are essentially humans with unlimited power, but with all the foibles that humans have regularly. So there's no recourse for Arachne and Niobe to prevent the gods from taking their vengeance. And there's no kind of accountability. This means that the gods can punish people according to their whim. Arachne and Niobe are not particularly pleasant people, but what they do is also not that serious. It amounts to a personal insult. And in the end, what happens is that their lives are totally destroyed in a way that can never be taken back. So it's not just a difference in power, but it's power that's exercised according to whim and according to personal slight, as opposed to a system of rules. Finally, what I think is most disturbing about these stories is that if you think of a world in which people can be punished at any time by the gods, we might say that's worrying because it could happen to you or me. And that's true, and that's true in Ovid. But what usually happens in Ovid is that the people who are punished are people who are exceptional in some way. Maybe they're women who are especially beautiful. Maybe they're artists who are particularly good at playing the flute or at weaving, like Arachne is. Or maybe they're people who happen to be lucky enough to have many, many children. It's people who are exceptional, who are singled out for this kind of punishment according to the whim and the envy of the gods. Now, if you think about that and apply it to a whole world, that creates a world where it's dangerous to be exceptional and it's dangerous to be good at things. A world where mediocrity is what's rewarded. I find that extremely chilling. There are lots of things to love about ancient literature, but you wouldn't want to live in the world that it depicts. And I think when we transfer this to the modern era, there are lots of things to be proud of about being an American. And one of the greatest is the fact that we reject this kind of unfettered accumulation of power in a despot. That we advance an idea of an American dream where people who are exceptional, no matter who they are, can succeed because of that exceptional nature, that exceptional ability, not be punished. In many ways, the ideals of the American founders are the opposite to the world we see implied by what's going on in these stories by Ovid. And so I think as a whole, these stories in the Metamorphoses are a very useful way of reflecting on power and the dangers that despotism holds.